True opinions are a fine thing and do all sorts of good, so long as they stay in their place. But they will not stay long. They run away from a man's mind, so they are not worth much until you tether them by working out a reason. Once they are tied down, they become knowledge and are stable. That is why knowledge is something more valuable than right opinion. What distinguishes one from the other is the tether.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's experiment. The topic is thought, what it means to think, what is consciousness, some really fun and interesting stuff that will get your wheels spinning. I'm here today with my co-host and best bro,
The Brody Adonis, what's up? Some other fun things. Guess who graduated?
Oh yeah, we both did.
Nicolas and me, kind of. But yeah.
I mean, for the most part, summer classes don't count. You know what I mean? It's done.
Yeah, they don't. The thing is, like, I finished my my degree and my minor. Like, that's completely done.
Right.
But the university has deemed it that I need to take a few more units. But yeah, I mean, I'm pretty much graduated as well, I guess.
Yeah.
So yeah, cool. We are UC Davis alumni. Pretty crazy to think about.
It's kind of insane, but it's exciting. Also a little bit scary, like going into the real world. This was like a predetermined path. I feel like you're like, oh, go to college, like 4 years, blah blah blah, do all your classes, and then now it's like, hey, now it's like free range, figure out life. But it's exciting too, so that'd be cool.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, one thing we don't have to worry about anymore is homework. So
right,
that's the beauty of being a graduate, I guess. So,
right.
Anyways,
also like frequent exams. That was a bummer.
Don't. Oh God. Anyways, so yeah. Speaking of exams and things like that, a lot of thought goes into exams. A lot of thinking.
Yes,
goes into
so much thinking
into being a good student.
Understanding,
and remembering and recalling and memory and all that. So what is thought to you when somebody asks you thought, or like what do you think the definition of thought is? What is your
my understanding of thought is like the internal dialogue that you have with yourself. So like whether or not that be by yourself or like around others, like if you are talking to someone and you're obviously thinking, right? If you're actively listening, then you're thinking about what they're saying. So you're having like an internal dialogue. Okay, this is how I'm going to respond to what this person's saying, right? And then just obviously by yourself, if you're just completely alone, you're probably have an internal dialogue, maybe even talking to yourself. If you're in like a classroom, let's say, and you're learning information, you're thinking about how you're going to absorb that information and then practice it in whatever way you might have to practice it. So that's kind of how I think of thought as like the internal dialogue between yourself, which is kind of weird because then it almost implies that there's like two of you, I guess. But I don't know. That's how I think of it.
Interesting. So would you say thought or thought? Would you say thought is something that can be quantified? Do you think it can be? Yeah.
I mean, I think it is, right? Because you can see like the different activity in different areas of the brain based on like something that you're thinking about. Like I was just watching this YouTube video where they talked about how if you are thinking of doing something versus if you're actually doing it, the like region in the brain like lights up the same. Like they always use that term light up. Like the neurons are firing in the same region of the brain. So I think that is a way to quantify thought.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I agree. That's a good point. So I guess you could say, so do you think thought is so you don't believe that thought is exclusive to one area of the brain, but rather whatever is most activated, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would think so. I mean, something that's like interesting is they've like talked about how thought can manipulate the way your brain like looks, like the shape of it. So it's like, does that mean because I don't know, like conventional physics would tell you that there has to be a force being applied to change the shape of something, right? So does that mean that thought is matter in some way? That's kind of an interesting segue into from this topic, is like how, like, is what I mean, it is what is thought, but maybe a viewpoint is what I'm trying to say. Like that thought is like a physical thing that our body, like just like we, like, I don't know, like excrete sweat from our glands, like we produce that, like is thought something that we produce, and therefore it's like a physical like substance.
Interesting. I don't. Yeah. So then begs the question, like you said, can thought be, I don't want to say measured, because then at that point it goes back to being whether or not it can be quantified, which we kind of agree that it can, dependent on the regions of the brain that are active during a thought.
Mm-hmm.
So when you think thought, do you think what about the brain physically is creating thought? So would you say it's the activation of neurons? Would you say it's the way you behave? What do you think is the physical measurement of thought?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's the activation of neurons. If you're thinking about, like, I mean, it also like depends on how you view um, just like consciousness, right? Like if you view consciousness as something that is a direct product of the chemical activities like occurring in your brain, the firing of neurons, the activation potential, and things like that, like then you would say yes, it's quantified by the like neurons firing. However, there's like other kind of ideas where consciousness is separate from the brain firing, where maybe the brain is actually taking control of all of the things that we don't really pay attention to, like my heart beating and my breathing on a normal basis, the involuntary actions. And then there's consciousness, which is a separate thing. And then maybe in that way, thought could not be quantified because it's not really something that we understand. So I don't know, two different ways of looking at it, I guess.
Yeah, that's true. And to touch on consciousness, there are actually studies done by philosophers and things like that. One in particular is Peter. I can't say his last name. Peter Caruthers. He's a distinguished university professor of philosophy at the University of Maryland,
Okay.
in College Park, and he basically he draws from empirical studies done within psychology and cognitive neuroscience, and he believes, or he's coming to the conclusion, that we actually don't have conscious thought. So the idea of conscious thought, it assumes a position that we think of thinking, we think of coming up with a thought, whereas in reality there is a lot of subconscious mechanisms at play that kind of bring that thought to fruition. It's kind of like that one study that you told me about, by that French scientist. Well, I forgot his name. He basically, you know who I'm talking about, right? He did that study where he tried to come up with whether or not free will actually existed. I forgot his name.
Yeah,
But yeah. So, anyways, he came up to a conclusion that, or at least the experiment yielded a result that said conscious thought, or in this case, free will, doesn't exist. Because there is preconscious mechanisms at play that actually bring these I guess conscious things to fruition. What do you think about that?
So basically, my understanding of it is that the brain is kind of by itself, like in the same way, if you touch a hot stove, it tells your hand, like it pulls your hand away without you thinking about it. The brain in itself is just firing a bunch of neurons, right? And that firing of neurons then is causing thoughts to occur. So then maybe maybe the brain is then recognizing its own thought, and that's where that internal dialogue comes from. So yeah, there is no true consciousness wherein a consciousness by itself is then thinking, oh, I need to think this or I need to do this in its own right. Our like perceived consciousness is actually the result of chemical reactions and bodily functions and all that stuff. And therefore, consciousness and free will do not exist within the human mind.
Very interesting. So, I found the scientist's name, Benjamin Labay.
Mm.
So, oddly enough, he actually died in Davis, California.
What?
Yeah.
That's interesting. Did he?
Yeah, he in 2000 in July 23rd, 2007, he actually died in Davis, California.
Whoa.
Yeah, pretty crazy, right? So he was actually a researcher in the psychology department at UC SF, so University of California, San Francisco, which is an extremely prestigious school, right?
Yeah.
So, but there was a lot of issues with it, with his experiment, because apparently the study, the participant or the subject within the study, it was up to that person to click the button, which kind of recorded them having, you know, a muscular. The whole experiment was based on like muscular movement and
Right.
tension within the
It was
muscles.
like a raised hand, right? Like they
Yeah,
would
yeah, like
raise their
raising a
hand.
hand. Exactly. And so it was up to the subjects to push the button that recorded, you know, that data. So there's a lot of like discrepancies within the study that a lot of people argue, but I think it's still really interesting to consider whether or not um, consciousness, free will, or thought are an actual conscious thing that occur.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, there's a lot of you know explanations of what thought actually is. You know, for example, you can be stimulated by an external stimuli, right? Let's say it's a visual stimuli.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a whole bunch of mechanisms activate in your eye that go to your occipital lobe that then transfer to the different areas in your brain to create a thought. So, like, let's say a ball is coming towards you, right? Your
Yes.
eyes perceive this ball, your neurons activate, they shoot back into your occipital lobe, and then they go into, you know, your ganglious nucleus, this, that, and it activates the reaction for you to dodge the ball. So you have this thought in between you seeing the ball and you making a reaction to the stimulus, where I guess that thought of get the hell out of the way occurs, right?
Right.
So I think that's what the whole premise behind that conscious thought doesn't exist. It's more of a how do I put this? It's more of a like an automated response
Right.
to whatever it is that is creating, to whatever the stimulus is.
So in that way, so I guess piggybacking off that, you could think of thought, like, because I was talking about how it was like a material thing, like it was real, like a piece of matter. So in the same way that like you go to the gym and lift weights, you can exercise your brain by stimulating it through thought, right? So if I'm reading books or listening to podcasts or watching movies, that is triggering thought in the same way that when I lift a weight, it strains my muscles. Then that strains the brain, which then causes it to develop in a certain way, which would kind of become characteristically more, I guess, smart or intelligent as we've predetermined.
Yeah. Yeah, so I agree, because there was actually, interesting enough to what you just said about the brain, kind of having different structural, you know, integrity to it, dependent on, you know, whatever it is that you're thinking of or whatever it is that you've experienced.
Mm-hmm.
There was actually a study done, I believe it was in Italy, or it was a European country, where they found that the taxi drivers of that, it could have been London, taxi drivers within that city or within that country, their I believe it was their hippocampus. It was a lot larger than the average person because they had to memorize the
Oh yeah.
intricacies of the streets within the city that they were in or within the country that they were in. So they found that their hippocampus was a lot larger than you and I. But
Yeah.
whereas we
Yeah.
don't have to measure, or we don't have to remember or recall like all the intricacies within the streets, because we know how complicated those look, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that you definitely bring up a good point, and then a study backs that point. So that's really, really interesting. And I guess that goes with the importance of brain plasticity. If your brain isn't, if it's not able to adapt, chances are you're not going to get very far.
Right. Well, I mean, to pose a counter argument to that, I think, or even more so, just a pretty heavy point here is that I think with the invention of the internet and our access to it through smartphones and things like that, the requirement of us thinking has significantly declined. So looking at the example of the taxi drivers, I'm sure that study was done pre-GPS, pre-smartphone. You know what I mean? Now there's absolutely no reason to memorize the streets like that. You would just, it's all done by a computer, which is attached to your car. So like, even, I mean, that's just one example, but I think nowadays it's becoming harder and harder to think for yourself, whether it is something that you're doing for yourself or not. I think we're just limiting the amount of stimulus that we're getting because everything is now done for us. You know what I mean? You don't really have to critically think as often to navigate through life. And so it's interesting, what effect is this decrease in thought as a society going to have, down the line?
Yeah. So in a way, we're becoming I feel like there's a rise in codependency to our technology, right?
Yeah.
And that could very well affect the structure of our brain. It could get smaller because we don't have to think as much as I don't want to say we won't have to think, but we won't have to cogitate within deep thought as much as we once needed to. Like, for example, those taxi drivers, like you said, now they have, a cell phone or a GPS system built into their car where they don't need to memorize these alleyways or the when to turn right, when to turn left. So an interesting study would be to see if to kind of follow, like do a cohort study and follow newer taxi drivers that use this technology from the beginning of their job, and then compare the structure of the brain with theirs with the individuals that didn't have the technology, so they had to memorize it, and see if there is a difference in between the brain structure.
Yeah,
I think that would be an interesting study.
That would be.
Yeah. So, and since we're talking about technology and stuff and thought, I think a good segue to this would be artificial intelligence.
Oh no.
Dun, dun, dun. So it's interesting, not necessarily artificial intelligence, but how scientists are trying to mimic human cogitation within a computer system, or if it's even possible. So before we dive into that, what do you think? Just to kind of lay a framework or a foundation. What's your opinion on all that?
So, I mean, based on like what we've discussed so far, right? Thought is the reaction to a bunch of different stimuli from the surrounding environment. With that being said, I feel like it could be feasible to program a massive computer to react to stimuli the same way that our brain does. However, I feel like for it to be equal to the brain, it would have to therefore be able to absorb any piece of information that could be thrown at it within like this dimension pretty much, and then spit back a reaction that would be equivalent to a human reaction. Here's the thing, to like our knowledge, computers aren't plastic as the brain is, right? The brain's malleable; it can change shape. The neurons can die and then grow back, and then you know what I mean. So there's all these different things that the brain. It's a living organism. How do you develop a computer that can, you know, actively lose information or lose components and then regrow components, can change shape to optimize the way that it learns? That would be, I feel like, a massive feat to undertake. So I don't know. It seems almost impossible, but that's just me.
Yeah, I agree with you. And so here's the thing about that, right? So did you know that you're aware of what supercomputers are, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. So the most powerful supercomputer is still only 1/13 as powerful as the human brain, meaning the human brain is still 30 times more powerful than the most powerful supercomputer.
That's crazy.
So it's clear that there is still a long way to go until we reach some sort of, I guess they call it a singularity,
Mm-hmm.
where a machine outsmarts, the collective human brain, right?
Right.
And so with that in mind, it's also interesting because there's a lot of like when you hear artificial intelligence, when you hear these type of things, it's like a buzzword, right?
Mm-hmm.
You get excited, like, ooh, like sci-fi, end of the world. That's usually what comes to mind. Machines taking over. Terminator. You
Yeah.
think of Terminator, right?
Right. Right.
Skynet. So it's interesting to kind of come back to reality, because you have to think, right? In order for a computer to do a simple task like recognize a face, like you and I, right? Like let's say there is a orientation of fruit on a table, okay? And it's
Mm-hmm.
oriented in such a way that it resembles a human face, right? It's got eyes, it's got a mouth, it's got a nose. Though the way that the fruits are oriented, it creates a face.
Right.
You and I looking at this, we'll recognize that under a second, right?
Mm-hmm.
We'll be like, "Oh, that's a face. Interesting." Like, yeah, it's fruit, but they're organized in a way where it's a face. A computer looking at that, there is so many intricate steps. I mean, there are intricate steps for the human brain, but for a for a computer, there are so many intricate steps involved, where if one thing goes wrong in the very, very beginning, right? Like if because a computer runs off what? Algorithms, right? If there's something wrong within the algorithm in the very, very beginning of it, the whole thing falls apart.
Mm-hmm.
So our brain is able to basically catch itself and then fix itself like so fast that whereas a computer, if something goes wrong within the algorithm, the whole thing collapses.
Right.
So that's what I'm saying. It's like important to remember how far we actually are from this, singularity.
Right. I mean, but at the same time, I know that like with AI, there's I guess like not learner, like teacher code, where it's like, so there's like the main code of like the AI, and then like there's a separate kind of like program running that's basically teaching that other code, like when it's right or wrong. So if you like join those together, you start getting something that like more closely resembles like the brain in that way. Like if like you showed me like a picture of a face, like a face made of fruit, and let's say for some reason like I did say it was a face, like a human face, then like someone would be like no, and then I'd automatically be like, okay, that's not, and then the next time I would say that it's not, right? So I guess with AI, it would have to cross reference a bunch of different like images of a face, and then like the the teaching code or a program or algorithm would tell the actual artificial intelligence like that's like identifying faces, like it would notify it when it's wrong, and then every time that like occurrence happened, that would like alter the code in the same way that our brain is changed like in those type of negative reactions, if that makes sense. So like
Right. Yeah.
yeah, so I guess in that way it could learn, but again that would like that's just a very like small example of a way that we could inch closer to the human brain. But I don't know. It's in like basically they're trying to figure out, scientists, is how to mimic the brain is trying to create itself, which almost seems just like anti like it just doesn't seem possible for something to like create itself. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. It's weird. Like when you think about it from a philosophical perspective, we're just the brain studying itself, right?
Hmm.
And we have like this fascination with recreating things that already exist. Isn't that weird? Like the brain already exists, but we're so fascinated with the idea of being able to recreate it, whether it's synthetically or whatever means, right?
Hmm.
Or computationally. And so to go back to the point that you were making about AI teaching itself, so a Google scientist actually it she taught AI to build better AI. So what you were talking about was there's like a overseer AI
Hmm.
that watches over a learner AI, right?
Hmm.
And then the learner kind of it goes through whatever, right? It runs its algorithm. It goes through the steps of input, goes into the hidden nodes, and then it goes into the output, and then it back propagates. So basically, how a AI works in like explain it like it's five. Explain it to me like I'm five situation. You have an input layer, which is a node. The neurons are called nodes. You put an input in the input node, it shoots it into the hidden layers. There could be hundreds, thousands, there could be millions of hidden layers. And each of those nodes within those layers are responsible for a certain attribute or a certain aspect within what you are looking for. So, say you are looking for a house, right? One node would be responsible for how many rooms a house has. The other node would be responsible for what color the walls are, and so on, right? And obviously, each of these nodes have different weights. Obviously, the higher weight means that should be prioritized more. So, let's say you want a house with 5 rooms, that will have a higher prioritization or a higher weight than, say, the color of the house, which you want white, but you don't really care. So, and then it takes all of that and it shoots it into the output layer or into the output. And then there's a goal that you want to reach within the output. The output node compares it with the output that you want. And if it doesn't match it, it shoots it back into the hidden layers or into the hidden nodes. That's
Hmm.
called back propagation. So it takes what the output was, puts it back propagates it, and it reruns that algorithm until it gets closer and closer the to the output value that you want or that you had set.
Hmm.
And so that's essentially how the human mind works too, right?
Hmm.
So um where was I going? Oh, so I was talking about how neurons work. So now we go back to the learner and then the teacher. So the learner runs all these algorithms, and then the teacher AI watches the learner and then corrects the learner AI. Like, no, fix this, fix this, fix this.
Hmm.
And so that I don't know. I just wanted to point that out because what you said, it was that's I think that's what you were talking about, right? Like how there's two AIs and then one teaches the other. Is
Right.
that okay?
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yes.
yeah. So I don't know. I thought that was really interesting. So
Right. But the brain doesn't need that, and we still come up with thought. So
yeah, the brain doesn't need it. And then yes, it's just crazy. Like we take it for granted. I feel like not for granted, but we just don't. The average person doesn't think about it. Like they don't think about what thinking is. I guess that's why we have this podcast, right? We
yeah,
talk
we
about
want
things
people.
that people don't necessarily think about.
Yeah, but
And then when you try to build thought or
mhm,
build a brain, you begin to see how intricate just a simple step like recognizing a face actually is. So,
I got a question for you.
yes.
What is the difference between knowledge and thought?
Okay. So, knowledge so I would like to quote I believe it was Plato. he basically said, knowledge, the only thing that separates knowledge from truth is that you have a whole bunch of opinions, right?
Hmm.
And then if those opinions don't become tethered to something that can hold them together, then something that can ensure that they exist, then it won't become knowledge. So knowledge is uh the tethered collective of facts. That is knowledge. Something that you can always go back to. Because if it isn't tethered, it will fade away and then the knowledge is lost.
Hmm.
So that's somebody's shooting out fireworks. So that is what knowledge is, and I'll find the actual quote, and then I'll read it off to you a little later. But that's what knowledge is, and then thought. And you wanted to know what the difference between knowledge and thought is.
Right.
So okay, so thought I think is the very rudimentary form of what knowledge is. So you can have a thought, right?
Hmm.
You can have a thought about something that is already knowledge. Like, okay, we have AI, and you know what AI is. That is knowledge.
Hmm.
And then you can take that and you can begin to build something that complements the previous knowledge. So we know what AI is. Okay, you have a thought about AI that could make it better, and then you research, you follow up on that thought, and then with a whole bunch of other people that have identical thoughts, and then you bring those thoughts together and you create something, you tether it, which eventually becomes knowledge.
Mm.
So
I see what you're saying.
it's kind of like the scientific method, really, right? Like if you have, a theory, you experiment on that theory, and then you put the theory together, you come up with okay, I think this is what's going to happen. And if that happens, then that becomes knowledge. Obviously, you have to replicate it, and other people have to test it to make sure they yield the same results. But I think thought and knowledge are very similar, or you can create a parallel with the scientific method.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense what you're saying, and I think what you're saying is that knowledge is born from thought. So you have this
Right, right, yeah.
collection of thoughts, either like from one individual or a group of people, and that gets proven in some way or validated and or tethered, and then that can become knowledge once other people accept it and then learn it and then associate their thinking and their thoughts with that knowledge, and then that builds on the knowledge. And yeah, so it's like almost like, yeah, knowledge is born from thought, which is, I never thought of it like that, but it makes a lot of sense.
Right, yeah. So it's yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I can't really add anything to that. I think you kind of touched uh touched it up very well. So what else, man? Shoot.
I don't know.
What else can we really touch on about knowledge? I can't find that quote, but that's essentially what it was. It was he was saying that how you can, if we do not tether these thoughts or these facts together, and ensure that they don't drift away or they don't break, then that knowledge breaks and knowledge disappears. It's kind of like how sorry, go ahead. I'll go back to it. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I'm beginning to think of like, because I just said that knowledge was born from thought, but that's not like, it's not a one-way street. I think that thought is also born from knowledge. So you have these, things, and then thoughts about those things can rise up and then become its own knowledge. I mean, just like what we were talking about with AI, right? So you have knowledge of AI and you think of something. So then that thought was born from the knowledge of AI, or I mean, that could be applied to anything. That was just an example. But in the same way that knowledge is a product of thought. So it's almost like this cycle of knowledge, thought, knowledge, thought. So like kind of they feed off of each other. It's not so much that thought breeds knowledge. It's more so that they are within like this like yin and yang balance of each other, which I think is a cool way to think about it. That's why I just wanted to poke that in there.
Yeah. So it's like the what came first, the chicken or the egg.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, that's essentially what it is. Like, what came first, thought or knowledge?
Right.
What do you think came first?
There
There we go.
I would say thought, probably, because I feel like knowledge is a little bit more structured. You know what I mean? So
Right. Yeah.
like you didn't have to like I feel like there didn't have to be knowledge to come up with the first thought. But I feel like there unless unless you say you have to know how to think, but based on what we're talking about, you don't have to know how to think. It's just a reaction. So yeah, I would say thought came first, probably.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I mean, whew, that was a big thought experiment. This episode has been a very, very big thought experiment. Speaking of thought. Um, so with that said, what I'll do is I will find that quote and I will put it in the introduction of this episode. So if you got this far, you will know what quote I was referring to about knowledge. Because I think it's a pretty good, it's a really good quote, actually. It's one of my favorites, so I'm kind of mad that I don't remember it. But that's what I'll do. So anything else you wanted to add, Nick?
I would just say think as much as you possibly can. I don't know about like I feel like a lot of people like to just absorb information, and I guess that's fine, right? You're just like absorbing information that's getting put into your knowledge base. But I always advocate for like critical thinking, always question things, always because I think that's like what kind of quantifies your intelligence. I mean, I don't want to be like you're not smart if you don't think. Some people would say you're not smart if you don't have a huge knowledge base, right? So it's just kind of that's like an opinionated stance. But I just feel like if you're always thinking, you're going to be better off in life, and that's why I was just gonna like tie this into like a little motivational speech. Just always think about what you're doing in the moment. Think about how you could change your current position. Think about how you can help others. Just if you're constantly thinking, I think I think that's a good thing.
I agree. I agree. And what you said was a perfect closing statement. So what I will leave everybody with is a quote from Rene Descartes, and it is cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Thank you for listening, and remember, this is an experiment.